In the previous video, we actually talked about the linked list. And in this video, what we're going to do is actually start using it in our code. So I've opened the project that I created originally in the previous video. I'm going to create a new class to leave the other one as it was. I'm going to call it demo. And when you're creating a new class in IntelliJ, if you want a main method so that you can actually execute it, there's actually a shortcut. You can type PSVM, which stands for public static void main. And if you press tab, before I do that, you can see on the screen, it actually tells you that what it's going to do, main method declaration. Press tab now, actually creates that for us. Because it's something that you want to do in a lot of Java programs, IntelliJ makes your life easier, makes life easier for you by allowing it to work. So next, let's create a linked list. And what we're going to do is create a linked list of the places to visit, which is the capital cities in Australia that we talked about in the previous video. So I'm going to type in linked list, string. I'm going to call it places to visit equals new, and it's going to be linked list, and I'll just press enter there, and that's the default declaration, and it looks very similar to an array list, but of course it's a linked list. So adding records is very similar as well. We do that we type in the name of the variable, places to visit.add, and we just type in literally the places. So Sydney. So I'm going to add a few entries here. I'm going to add do a couple of different ones. We're going to do Melbourne, Brisbane, let's do Perth, Canberra, good old Adelaide where I live, and we'll do Darwin as well. So I think I've got one too many there. So that's enough now. So, and we can actually create a method. What I'm going to do is actually create a method that actually prints them out. I'm going to type print list places to visit. So we're going to pass the parameter of the linked list. So I'm going to create that method now. And the print list is going to accept the parameter of our linked list. And it's going to use the concept of an iterator. I'm going to type in private static void because we don't need to return anything, print list. And the value we're going to be accepting as a parameter is linked list string, and we'll just call it linked list, like so. And what we're going to do is just use this concept of an iterator. So an iterator is another way of accessing and going through all entries that are in a particular array or an array list or a linked list, etc. So it's got a concept. I'll type it out and then we'll go through it. So we'll type iterator string I equals a linked list dot iterator. So notice that the dot iterator, that method is actually part of the linked list, comes with it automatically. So again, we're doing the equivalent to a for loop, for loop for I equals 0, I less than places to visit dot size. We're doing something like that, but we're doing it in a different way. So what we're going to do is type in while I dot has next. Then we're going to do system dot out, now visiting I dot next. Then we're going to do at the end, we'll just print out some equal signs just to show that we're at the end. So what this is actually doing, it's actually, and going back to the linked list, you remember that a linked list entry pointed to another entry. So what we're doing is we're saying while an element that's in this linked list is pointing to something else, in other words, there's at least one more record to actually visit, while that is true, we're actually going to show the current record. And the I.next is actually part of that. So what that actually does, it actually sets it. Then as we go through and use I.next, that actually also changes the value of the iterator. So that's equivalent to typing, I++, I equals I plus 1. So we're actually saying output the I.next, which actually gives you the current record, but that also then moves on to the next record as well. So consequently, has next is just saying, is there another entry? But .next is actually moving to the next entry, but it's actually returning what the current value is before it moves on. So that's why we can actually put now visiting, and that will show in the first time we run this, it will actually show Sydney. So it will show Sydney, but then automatically move to Brisbane. So that's actually how it works. So let's just try running this to make sure that it actually does work. And you can see it's now visiting Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Canberra, Adelaide, and Darwin. So it's gone through the whole list automatically, as you can see, and it's working nicely. So let's actually go back here and add some more code. Let's actually insert a record. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert Alice Springs, and that's going to be in index position 1, which of course is immediately after Sydney. So if we do that, if we type places to visit, .add, So we're saying at element at the index position 1, we're going to add Alice Springs. Let's do that. And then let's then also print out the result. So let's try that and see what happens. So you can see the first time we had Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, etc. The second time we've now got now visiting Sydney, Alice Springs, and notice how Alice Springs is now automatically linking to Melbourne. So this has happened automatically. We've inserted that entry, so you can see what's happened when we inserted Alice Springs. Sydney is now pointing to Alice Springs, and Alice Springs is pointing to Melbourne. Whereas the first time we actually ran through, Sydney was pointing to Melbourne. So just by you typing in that command to insert that record with the index position, the actual linked list functionality in Java is done that for you automatically, which is pretty cool. That's sort of built in to do that. So that's how to add a new entry to insert a position. That's how to insert a new record. If we want to remove one, similarly, we can do something like places to visit.remove, and we want to remove the element position 4. So we do that, and we actually run the code again. Or actually, what we'll do is actually add a print first. We'll run the code again now. And we can see automatically what's happened there. The first list we had Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. Then we had Sydney, Alice Springs, Melbourne. This time we've got Sydney, Alice Springs, Melbourne, Brisbane, but there's no Perth. And Perth was, of course, index position 4, which is actually the 5th element. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was Perth. That was the index position 4, which, of course, is element 5. So by typing the remove, you can see that what happened was Brisbane, which was pointing to Perth, Brisbane is now pointing to Canberra. So Perth has been sort of removed completely. And that's how a linked list works. So you can see it's pretty cool that it does a lot of that for you automatically. And it handles the linking to the next records, the next one in the list automatically for you. And of course, with this mechanism, if you had thousands of records, there's not really going to be any slowdown in performance because it's literally only changing 1 or 2 entries at most. Everything else remains in the same position. Now, at the moment, we haven't really done anything that couldn't be done with an array or an array list. In actual fact, when it comes to adding Alice Springs, we had to count into the list to find out the entry, the index position to add to. So we had to actually tell it we want to add it at this position. Likewise, for deleting Perth, we had to count the number of items and actually decide ourselves by passing the number as to which element we wanted to remove. So let me now show you the advantages of a linked list. What I'm going to do is add the cities in alphabetical order. Now, alphabetically may not be the best way to visit the cities in a country the size of Australia, but really the important thing here is we're going to be imposing an order. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be saying that every time an entry is added to the linked list, we're going to make sure that it's actually added in alphabetical order. So if this was real, you'd use some other algorithm to work out the distances or something like that and figure out the most efficient way and perhaps add it in that way. But in this case, just as an example, we're going to do it in alphabetical order. So we're going to start off with an empty list. That means that the first item to be added is always going to be added right at the start. But when it comes to add the second item, what we're going to do is we're going to compare it to the first, and then 3 things can actually happen. Firstly, if it's the same as the first, in other words, if it's a duplicate, well, we don't want to visit the same city twice. So if that's the case, we're going to ignore that entry and not actually accept it. If it sorts alphabetically before the first city, and that's the case, we want to insert it before the current city. And if it alphabetically is greater than the current city, if that's the case, we want to move it to the next city, and then we want to repeat the process. So you can see that by comparing that as we're actually inserting it, we can put it in the right place each time. So eventually, when we get to the end of the list, if the item has not been added by now, then it belongs to the end. So we'll add it there and implement it. And we're going to be using something similar to an iterator, and that's called a list iterator. So what I'm going to do now is just type in some of the code, and then we'll go through it and actually try running it. So I'm going to create this method. I'll close down this run window for now. I'm going to use private static boolean add in order. So the parameters we're going to have here, the parameter is going to be the new city, string new city. But for demo purposes, I'll also add another one. We're going to add a parameter which will be the actual linked list itself that we want to actually add data to. So we'll call that linked list. Like so. So the first thing we need to do is create an iterator, and you saw that in the previous code example above. We used linkedList.iterator. But we're going to use what's called a list iterator. And as you'll see, a list iterator gives you some more flexibility than a traditional iterator. And it's really made for situations like this where we're inserting and inserting records and so forth. So we're going to type string list iterator equals, and it's going to be linkedList.iterator. We're going to type while, and that should have been list iterator. List iterator, like so. While string list iterator dot has next. We're going to go through all the records. And I'll just make a bit of space here so we can see what we're typing a bit better. So we've got our list iterator, remembering that the first entry, or when you create this for the first time and when you point it to the list iterator, it's automatically going to go to the very first entry that's stored in the linked list. Then we're going to use the dot has next, and using the while loop, we're going to navigate through all entries that are in this string list iterator. Then we're going to use a compare to function, which we haven't talked about before. So we're going to type int comparison equals string list iterator dot next. So we're moving to the next record dot compare to new city, which of course was the variable that was passed to this method, which is the city that we're looking to insert. So what that gives us is a number. So it gives us a number. If the number that is returned, the integer, if it's 0, it means that both the value that's in the string is in the linked list that the current index entry that we're searching for is equal to the new city variable in this case. So there's, in other words, 0 means that they actually match. If that's the case, we don't want to add anything. So we're going to put if comparison equals 0. So that means they're equal. Do not add. So that would mean, for example, if we had the city being Adelaide already, we're actually using that as a parameter to pass to this method. And if that was also the entry, going through the while loop that we were currently looking at, we don't want to add Adelaide again. So if that's the case, we're going to print out a message that says new city plus is already included or as a destination. We don't want to add it again. And we're going to type return false. False meaning that it wasn't successfully added. Otherwise, we can do else if comparison, if it's greater than 0, what that means is the new item should appear before this one. So if that's the case, we're going to say it's the new city should appear before this one. And the example of that would be if we're currently looking at the record for Brisbane, but if Adelaide was passed as a parameter, then Adelaide alphabetically starts before Brisbane, so A comes before B, so comparison would return a number greater than 0 if that was the case, so we would want to add it. But we've actually got a problem at this point, and the problem is we've already used .next. So in other words, we've already moved on to the next record. So we've done the comparison, we've actually checked it, but the comparison was chosen when we used .next. So we used the .next, which returned the current entry, but then it moved to the next entry automatically. So what we actually need to do in this case, if comparison is greater than 0, we need to move back to the previous entry again, the one that we're at. In other words, in this case, Brisbane. Then we want to add new city. So to do that, we type string list iterator.previous. Previous means go back to the previous entry, the previous match. So in other words, go back to the record that's linked to this one. String list iterator.add new city. Then we then add the city at that point so that ultimately it's going to appear before that entry. So in this case, again, if we're looking at Brisbane and we found Adelaide, Adelaide was passed as a parameter, then by using the .previous, it goes back to the Brisbane record, and then by using .add, that's actually going to go and add it at the right position. It's going to add it in that entry. And that's what the .previous does. So we're using this special type of list iterator because normally you can't do that with a regular iterator. Normally you've just got to go through all the records. There's no way for you to go back to a previous record. But the list iterator is a special type of iterator that enables us to actually do that. So that's why we're actually doing that. So if that's the case, we were able to add the record. So that was good. So the record was added successfully. So we can return true. Else, if comparison, if it's less than 0, move on to next city. In other words, we don't need to actually add anything there. So that was a situation where we actually found, in the case, let's say Brisbane was passed as a parameter and we actually add Adelaide. Well, Brisbane doesn't come before Adelaide, so we don't want to do anything in that case because obviously we need to move on to the next record because that record can't be added here. And because we've done the .next up here, automatically it's already moved on to the next record anyway, so we don't need to actually do any processing at that point. And finally, at the end of the while loop, so here, if we get down this far, what that means is we've gone through the entire list without finding a suitable point to insert the entry. So the new item actually has to go to the end of the list in that case. So all we really need to do there is type string list iterator dot add new city. And that's actually it. So what I'm going to do is end the video here. In the next video, we'll come back and we'll actually just discuss this a little bit more. And we'll actually go and change it so that we're actually running our code using this method and just see whether it does work, whether it does actually convert things and put them in alphabetical order. So I'll see you in the next video.